As we gear up for this upcoming weekend, we're still taking a look at the tropics on this Friday, July 20th, and as we see on the latest tropical weather outlooks, development is not imminent, but that's not to say there's nothing to talk about. The most recent service chart does not show anything menacing in the Gulf of Mexico, but we will take a close watch with that area. And elsewhere, there's a tropical wave moving into Jamaica and Cuba. There's also the same high amplitude wave we've been talking about for the past several days, approaching the Lesser Antilles. And finally, we're going to be paying attention to the monsoon trough out across the eastern Pacific. As we transition over to the latest regional visible satellite animation, there are three things that I would like for you to pay attention to. First off, you may notice this large conglomeration of hazy looking conditions out across the Atlantic, and this is the Saharan air layer that we talked about in a blog that we posted on the front page of 28storms.com early this morning. For more information on that, you can go ahead and check out the blog update. Elsewhere, you may notice that the convection is still running rampant out across the Gulf Coast states and the northern Gulf of Mexico. None of the models are showing any sign of tropical development, but as we talked about over the last 2 to 4 days, anytime you get convection that rolls off the southeast coastline and into the Gulf of Mexico this year, you still need to pay attention because that's how Hurricane Danny formed roughly 15 years ago. It started off as a blob of convection and it maintained itself over the Gulf, and then within just a few days it developed into a tropical storm and then went on to become a hurricane. So we're going to take a look at those Gulf of Mexico conditions. And also, before we move on to that, I did want to point out this tropical wave that's between Haiti and Cuba. You can see it generating some isolated convection out across the Caribbean, but we've got a lot of vertical wind shear down there. There's this upper tropospheric trough that has been plaguing much of the deep tropics for the last couple of weeks, ushering in vertical wind shear values that are just too high for any organized tropical activity. So as we take a more zoomed in look at the Gulf of Mexico convection, you may be somewhat impressed by this outflow looking feature. As you can see, the clouds are fanning out rather nicely here on the southern end of all this convection, and that would be a favorable signature to look for, but the problem is that it's being enhanced by a lot of northerly vertical wind shear, so anything that does try to organize right now near the surface is going to get blown away here by these northerly winds, and that's why we don't have nearly as impressive of a signature as we look more poleward and along the northern side of all of this. But despite the lack of organization, we do still have some flooding concerns out across southeast Louisiana. New Orleans has periodically gone under a flash flood warning, and there has been confirmed isolated street flooding within the city, and perhaps the city that has been most impacted so far this afternoon has been Houma, Louisiana, which is located just to the south of New Orleans. Now as we take a look at the water vapor animation, you can see that the large swirl over Cuba and the Florida Straits is the unfavorable upper level low that is ushering in all of the mid to upper level vertical wind shear. So conditions overall across the Gulf of Mexico should remain unfavorable for any development, and like we said, none of the model guidance, or at least the dynamical global models, are picking up on anything in the northern Gulf, but this is still going to be something that we'll keep a close watch on over the next day or so. We will briefly show an overview of the global models in just a moment, but first off, as we look into the eastern Pacific, the monsoon trough is expected to become more active here within the next 2 to 5 days, but as of right now there continue to be no signs of any tropical organization. So the first model we will take a look at this afternoon is the 12Z run of the GFS, and there are three things I would like to point out as we begin the animation. First off, you don't see much in the way of organization over the northern Gulf of Mexico, and any vorticity max that originates to the south of Louisiana is forecast by the GFS to move more inland over the next 24 to 72 hours. And also here by day 7, we've got another potential tropical cyclone moving west-northwest or northwest to the south of Mexico. Still not expecting any landfall threats down there, and that is the result of a lot of ridging to the north, which should keep much of the coastal areas safe from any organized tropical activity. And also finally by day 7, this is perhaps the most impressive tropical wave that the models have at least forecast to exit the coast of Africa so far this season. Now again, this is not right now, this is still just a 7-day forecast, but we've got a pretty impressive vorticity max at 850 millibars. And in terms of the vertical wind shear forecast from the GFS, we see that conditions are forecast to become a little bit more favorable toward the very tail end of July and into the first half of August. Now, this won't matter so much if we're still being plagued by a lot of Saharan air and subsidence, but in terms of the vertical wind shear, we do see more in the way of upper level ridging between Africa and the Lesser Antilles. So this could perhaps be the start of the Cape Verde hurricane season, but this is still very extended range. Also, just for comparison purposes, this is the 12Z run of the Canadian model, and the Canadian model is also trying to develop some tropical mischief from the monsoon trough out across the eastern Pacific. And what gives the GFS some credibility out across the coast of Africa is that at least by day 6, the CMC model is showing another tropical wave exiting the coast at around the same time, so we could be looking more out toward the Cape Verde Islands in roughly 1 week. So that wraps up your tropical weather update for this Friday. We'll have more updates throughout the weekend, and also keep it tuned to the blog for more updates on weather across the nation, and even some extended range blog updates pertaining to the tropics.